Okay, let's unpack this. You know that feeling, right? When you're staring at a page, your eyes are scanning the words, but the actual understanding feels, well, distant.
Hmm.
Like you're reading a totally different language, even though it's, English.
Yeah, absolutely. That gap.
That gap, exactly, between just seeing the words and having that real aha
Yeah.
moment where it just clicks. That's really what we're plunging into today.
And it's something we all want, isn't it? To
Yeah.
really absorb knowledge quickly, thoroughly, but without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Totally. We're basically on a mission here to help you bridge that gap, get those aha moments without, drowning in info.
And what's really fascinating is the material we've got offers some pretty compelling ideas about why that click doesn't always happen, and more importantly, maybe how we can make it happen more often.
Exactly. So this deep dive, it really centers on this concept of knowledge transfer. Our main source is Shiva Narayan Takshila Page's Father Book Unveiled, Navigating the Function Matrix of Knowledge Transfer.
Right, and we've also got some really interesting sort of real-world examples that kind of light these ideas up.
Yeah, they do. So forget just memorizing facts. We're really exploring how knowledge actually moves from, say, a book and properly takes root in your brain.
And the goal really is to pull out the key insights from this whole learnography framework, that's the term used, and see how it might make us, more effective learners.
Definitely. We're going to tackle some pretty intriguing ideas like the difference between what the source calls object language and human language in learning.
And also try to demystify things like the father book and mother book. Sounds a bit cryptic maybe, but stick with us.
Okay, so let's dive right in. One of the big distinctions they make right off the bat is between these two languages of learning. The quote is, learning is finished in object language, but understanding is done in human language.
Right.
Okay, so let's break that down. What exactly is this object language supposed to be?
Well, think of object language as the raw code of a subject, the really precise way knowledge is first created and written down.
Like math symbols or scientific terms.
Exactly. Mathematical symbols, specific scientific terminology, the jargon in any field, really. It's concentrated,
Yeah.
often symbolic, like EMCO. That's pure object language for a physics concept.
Gotcha. The raw code. Okay. And then human language is just, well, what we're doing now, everyday speech.
Precisely. It's the language we use to explain things, to translate those dense ideas into something hopefully more accessible.
Okay.
And this brings up an interesting point about, say, a traditional classroom setting. Teachers often act as translators, right? They take the object language from the textbook.
And explain it in human language so students get it.
Exactly. And the source material points out students often feel pretty comfortable with that human language explanation. It feels familiar.
But here's the twist, isn't it? The framework suggests that even if students kind of get the teacher's explanation, they might not be developing that deep, intuitive grasp of the original object language.
That's a really crucial point. Think of the object language as like the DNA of the subject.
Okay.
If you understand it directly, not just the translation, you can potentially manipulate it, maybe even create new knowledge within that field. It's like understanding the genetic code itself lets you do bioengineering.
Right. Whereas if you only ever see the translation.
If you only engage through that human language lens, you might miss the fundamental building blocks, the sort of deeper logic that's baked into the object language.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does this idea of the father book and its function matrix try to fix this? The source says the father book, or matrix book, is more than just a textbook. How so?
Well, what's interesting about the father book concept is its stated purpose. It's not just about delivering facts. It's designed to actively assess and improve something called brain page quality.
Brain page quality. What does that mean?
It basically refers to how well the information is organized and connected in your own mind. Think of it like having a really well-indexed, cross-referenced personal encyclopedia inside your head. The father book is meant to help you build that internal structure.
And a key part of this is the function matrix. Sounds technical.
It does, but think of it like a really carefully designed set of challenges. Questions, prompts, maybe even small projects, all organized around specific keywords.
Keywords.
Yeah, and these keywords act as matrices of knowledge transfer. They basically guide you to actively search for definitions for content within what the source calls the brain page spectrum.
So it's not passive reading. It's designed to make your brain actually do something with the information.
Exactly, that's the core idea. The source says this active engagement is key to stimulating the hippocampus, which it calls the brain's search engine, which is a neat analogy.
Yeah, I like that.
By actively searching, retrieving information in response to these prompts in the function matrix, you strengthen memory recall and, supposedly, get a much deeper understanding.
So the Father book shifts things away from just memorizing towards like active understanding and using the knowledge.
That seems to be the goal. Active understanding and application, rather than just rote learning.
And the source even mentions a parent could use this Father book at home, asking questions to sort of observe a child's brain page development. That's an interesting idea for learning outside school.
It really is. It kind of blurs the lines, doesn't it? Which leads nicely into this other distinction they make. Direct versus indirect learning. What's the deal there?
Well, as I understand it, direct learning is described as learning straight from the father teachers, the original creators of the knowledge, using that object language.
Right, the source.
Whereas indirect learning is what often happens in schools. Subject teachers translate that object language into the more accessible human language for students.
And like we were saying, the typical school system often relies heavily on this indirect model, wouldn't you say? The teacher is the interpreter.
Yeah, definitely seems that way. So what are the potential downsides, according to this framework, of relying mainly on that indirect approach?
Well, the source suggests students might become maybe less skilled at engaging directly with the original object language of a subject.
Mm-hmm.
They might start depending too much on the teacher's human language explanations and maybe lack the confidence to tackle problems independently or explore the subject more deeply on their own.
Right, going back to your DNA analogy.
Yeah. If you only ever see the translated protein, not the underlying code, your ability to really innovate or solve new problems in that area might be limited.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so the Father book isn't the only tool mentioned. There's also talk of a Mother book and something called Board Power. What are they about?
Right. The Mother book, also called the Spectrum book, is described as a tool for seeing how well someone understands the actual definitions within the object language, kind of checking the reflections of knowledge transfer.
So another assessment tool, maybe?
Seems like it.
Hmm.
And again, something parents could potentially use at home to gauge understanding. Board power is mentioned too as part of this process, but the bits we have don't really flesh out the specifics.
Okay.
But the critical takeaway seems to be that a lack of these active engagement tools, this spectrum and matrix stuff, could lead to what the source calls cognitive blindness of learning brain.
Cognitive blindness. Wow, that's a strong term.
It is. It suggests students might really struggle with comprehension and just lose interest if they're not actively engaged in this way.
Okay, so to make this more concrete, the source gives this example of Nitika, a class 6 student. What happened with her?
Yeah, the Nitika example is pretty striking. She was working on set theory problems in math, and apparently she managed to solve 95% of the tasks without any direct teaching.
95%? How?
By applying these ideas, brain page theory, and doing book reading to activate cortical channels. It's presented as a real-world case of how actively engaging with the material in its original form can lead to pretty significant independent learning.
That's incredible. But it does also say the teacher was still important for the last 5%. Why mention that?
Well, I think that's crucial. It balances the picture, doesn't it? It shows that while this approach emphasizes empowering the learner, the teacher's role is still vital.
Right, not obsolete.
Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
They provide guidance, help with those final tricky bits, offer support. They become more of a facilitator, maybe, than just a lecturer. It's framed as more of a partnership.
Okay, so the goal here isn't just about doing well on tests in school, is it? How does this whole function matrix idea supposedly help learners in the long run, beyond the classroom?
Yeah, the bigger aim seems to be cultivating critical thinking and ideally a lifelong love of learning. By getting students to actively wrestle with knowledge, to really grasp the object language of different fields.
They become more than just passive receivers.
Exactly. They develop the ability to analyze, to synthesize information, maybe even create new knowledge themselves. The source explicitly says the goal is to nurture active and confident knowledge creators.
Knowledge creators, that's ambitious. Okay, one last point. The source briefly touches on human nature. Things like the brain's reward system, fear, why students might chat instead of listening. How does that fit in?
It acknowledges that, yeah, seeking social interaction, pleasure, that's perfectly natural human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes the point that while chatting in human language in class might be enjoyable, The core of effective knowledge transfer, especially in this direct school model they talk about, happens through engaging with the subject matter in its object language.
So social interaction is fine, but it doesn't necessarily equal deep learning of the subject itself.
That seems to be the argument. True comprehension, deep understanding, comes from really grappling with the subject in its precise original form.
Okay, wow. Lots to think about there. Let's try to boil this down. What are the absolute key takeaways you think people listening should really hold on to from this?
Okay, well, I'd say first, that crucial difference between object language, the raw, technical language of knowledge, and human language, the language we use for explanation. Recognizing that distinction is key.
Right.
Second, the innovative idea of the Father Book and its function matrix as tools designed to make learners actively engage with that object language, aiming for deeper understanding and better memory.
Okay. Active engagement.
And third, that contrast between direct learning straight from the source in object language and indirect learning through translation. The idea that real knowledge transfer means actively grappling with the original stuff, not just getting a summary.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for you listening, if you're keen on learning more effectively, maybe understanding these principles could be, well, a bit of a game changer. When you encounter complex information, think, how can I engage more directly with its object language? Whether that's the technical terms, the formulas, the specific jargon, don't just settle for the simplified explanation.
Try to dig into that underlying structure, the precision of the original.
Exactly. That active engagement might be the key to unlocking those genuine aha moments we talked about at the start.
Yeah, which leads to a really good question for you to think about after this. Considering this difference between object language and human language, how might you consciously change your own approach when you tackle complex stuff in the future?
Right. How can you move beyond just understanding the words to really grasping the underlying knowledge in its sort of fundamental form?
Yeah, how can you become a more active participant, maybe even an architect, of your own knowledge transfer? Something to chew on.